Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. I can't even tell you how thrilled I am to be here with Lori R. King, one of my favorite writers, and we will have an entire hour to chat with her about a few things. Sherlock Holmes, Mary Russell, 30 years of The Beekeeper's Apprentice, so many things. But before we get to that, just a couple things. One is I want to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming. We couldn't do this fun stuff without them. And I would like to thank Lori for letting us share this with other libraries. And I have to say, 24 libraries jumped on this program because, when libraries work together, we make magic. And this is going to be a magical program. So you can buy signed books from Lori from Aesop's Fable, our very favorite indie bookstore. And I will put a link to that in the chat for you all. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. It's a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will be taking questions from there, not the chat, because I can't keep track of the chat. Pretty good at multitasking, but not that. So you may be asking, how did the Ashland Library, this little tiny town in Massachusetts, get Lori King to do a program with them? Well, Lori posted on Facebook, about 6 months ago?
Yeah.
That she was willing to do programs with libraries, bookstores, llama places, whatever. And as long as they were interested in having her. And so she put out the call and I was like, this can't be legit. But I was like, it's Lori, I have to try. And so I put my name in, threw my hat in the ring, and lo and behold, like a couple of months later, I get an email from Lori R. King. I was like, oh my gosh, is this legit? Until she showed up for this program, like about 15 minutes ago, I really didn't know if it was legit. But here we are, and so are all of you. So I am going to just jump right in and ask Lori, tell us about yourself. Tell us how you're celebrating the Beekeeper's Apprentice.
I'm celebrating all kinds of ways. I mean, for one thing, we're saying before we let the audience in how amazing this Zoom stuff is, because Mia says, well, I'm sitting here with Lori King, and she's thinking, we're 3,000 miles apart, honey. But we are together, and it's been a fabulous way of bringing people together. So I had last year I looked at the fact that The Beekeeper's Apprentice was turning 30. It had been 30 years since it was published, 1994. And I wanted to do something to celebrate. One of the things was we decided to do a big get-together conference. And so we were going to do it in Scottsdale, not really thinking about the fact that Scottsdale in February is not only the height of the tourist season, so it's hugely, hugely expensive, but it was also one of the golf tournaments, the Something Open, and it was Super Bowl weekend, so everybody would. So we said, I mean, I know people love me, but to come together with a hotel room that's like $800 or $900, I thought, I'll have an audience of 4. So instead of that,
I would have come. I would have come.
I would have felt really guilty about the whole thing. But so instead of that, we're doing 4 of them. And if you're interested, you can pop onto my webpage, and there's an event stuff, and we've got 4. We had the first one a week and a half ago in Santa Cruz, where I live. And it was just fabulous. And it's made me so happy because the next 3 will be in Seattle and Bethesda, Maryland, and in Nashville. So if any of you are lovers of Russell and Holmes, take a look. But the other thing I wanted to do was some library element, because I'm a library baby. The story in the family was that we moved regularly. I mean, we moved like every year or so when I was growing up. And the story was that we moved that often because my dad read his way through the adult section of the library and needed to move to a new library. So, my childhood growing up, we never had any money. We rarely bought books. Um, Also because we were moving so much that, carrying books around us. But we would go to the library at least once a week and come out with a huge stack of books. And I was one of those kids that was given a grown-up card very early. Um, because that's where my life was. When you're moving that often, I think I only had 2 years, all of my school history. I only had 2 years where I was in the same school in September that I had been in June. So when you just turned over that much, you find your friends on the shelves of the library, not in the classroom, because classrooms come and go, but libraries, you can always find Walter Farley.
Mhm.
So I wanted to do something that acknowledged libraries. When I started writing, libraries were where I did all my research because it was pre-Google.
Mhm.
We didn't have internet stuff. You couldn't look things up. And so you had to go in and do research. And they, I think, really shaped the early books, certainly the first 10 years or so when I was heavily involved in my local university, UC Santa Cruz Library. So I put out I pulled together a kind of survey of who, what is your library? Who are you in your position? What would you like? Do you want a live or video or either? Um, how many events a year do you do? How big is your group? What would you do in addition to having my event? Would you, show Sherlock Holmes movies? Would you have a beekeeper come in and talk about bees? And I started getting these fabulous applications from various parts of the country. I opened it up to the world, but I think people overseas were just so put off by the whole idea that they were all the responses I got were from America. So that's fine.
We're just
Um,
very assertive here.
well, if I guess if you found it hard to believe that I was doing this, somebody in England or New Zealand would have found it impossible. But anyway, so I took these applications and I went through them all and I noted the kinds of special things that I thought would be fun. And chose them. I chose a dozen, figuring one a month, although they're not every month and it works around people's schedule. So, but we're doing a dozen. Probably 2/3 of them are Zoom, but I'm doing a couple of live things, one local, one in Nashville, where I'm going to be in August, and one I'm doing for a women's prison at library down in Southern California.
Love it.
And I just, I think that it's so fun to have this variety of libraries available out there, and especially in modern times where libraries are the voice of history and rationality and community.
Mhm.
So libraries rock.
You'll get no disagreement from me or anybody in the audience, I believe. Uh,
Probably not.
Probably not.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a few questions of mine, and then I'm going to get right to audience questions because we already have a bunch. Um, did you always know you were going to be a writer?
No, no,
No.
no. You know, I think nowadays where schools make an effort to introduce kids to a lot of different options in the world. One of the things that kids are introduced to is the idea of being a writer. I know that I've done any number of, classroom things for middle grade mostly and high school, talking about what it is to be a writer and how you do it. But I never met a writer when I was growing up. I never, it was you went into the library and there's all these shelves, and I mean, God put those books on the shelf because Some of them would have these photographs of people in there. They didn't look like anyone I knew.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just figured that was part of, it's like the fancy cover, and they had a random person that they put on the back. I mean, obviously I knew people wrote them, but I didn't connect it with me. So it wasn't until I hit my 30s that I began to realize I I've been learning the storytelling skills since I was very small. And one thing that I could do after, a lifetime of reading and writing, and I had just finished a graduate degree, was put together an English sentence. And I thought, well, if I can do that, maybe I can put together a lot of English sentences and tell a story. It was also, my kids were small. My son had just gone to preschool 3 mornings a week. So I had, maybe 8 hours to myself every week. Yay. And my husband, who is a lot older than I, was looking towards retirement. But because he was in the academic world, I couldn't get a normal job because he was forever taking off in the summer and expected us to tag along with him. So I thought, well, maybe I can do this. And very fortunately, I managed to sell my first book before before I had to get a real job. So
Wow.
yay me.
Yay us.
And that's where it began. So I didn't really start thinking of myself as a writer until I actually was writing.
Mm-hmm. Well, the fact that you sort of grew up in libraries makes me think that you were a reader for sure. Did you gravitate towards mysteries back in the day?
No, I think I was mostly even when I was older, I mostly read science fiction in
Oh.
various kinds. Now you divide it into sci-fi and fantasy, but I I think if you had told me, Laura, you're going to be a writer, I would have assumed that you meant sci-fi. But when I started writing, I found that it was really difficult because there's no structure in a sci-fi novel. I mean, you can go anywhere. And I liked having some kind of, bones to the story.
Mm-hmm.
And it felt more natural to me to have the structure of a crime novel. And you can tack anything onto that. I mean, you can do amazing things with the genre, but it's pleasing as a writer because it has a certain pattern of how you tell the story.
Mm-hmm. And at what point did you decide to take on the Sherlock Holmes canon?
Well, I so I was 35 when I started writing seriously. I had played with writing a kind of futuristic novel about 4 or 5 years before that, and got about halfway through it and realized I had no idea where the story was going, and it took me a long time to finish it. But when my son was in preschool, my daughter was in school, and I was free a certain number of hours a week, I sat down and I wrote. I was 15 when I first met Sherlock Holmes. 15 years old with my nose in a book as I walked the Sussex Downs and nearly stepped on him. And then realized that I had no idea who Sherlock Holmes was and what to write next. So I then had to go and do research, but I'm good at research. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that, I mean, obviously some of the Holmes story had permeated my brain. I mean, I had read Speckled Band and Hound of the Baskervilles and that kind of thing in high school. And the Granada Television Jeremy Brett series was playing.
Mm.
I'm not sure where the Sussex connection came from, but it must have lodged in there somewhere because that was there from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember if that was in the Jeremy Brett ones or not. I couldn't tell you. But when I then went out and I bought the stories and read my way through them and discovered this fascinating character, because I mean, if you come to Sherlock Holmes from an outsider, you tend to think of him as being this kind of dry, passionless, thinking machine. And that was not the character that I saw in the Conan Doyle stories. I saw a man who dedicated his life, body and soul to the idea of justice. I saw a man who didn't make friendships easily, but when he did, they were profound. And I saw stories that had humor in them that I hadn't expected. And all those things together meant that I could think of telling a story with this character, built around this character, in some really interesting ways. Now, I didn't really want to write Sherlock Holmes stories, the pastiches, as they're called.
Mm.
I wanted to write about that kind of mind, but in a different person, so that what would that amazing mind look like if it were in a young female 20th century feminist person instead? I mean, these were, I always had envisioned Beekeeper and then going on from there as a coming of age story of an extraordinary mind.
Mhm.
And she's obviously patterned on Holmes. I mean, the two of them are similar people from the get-go.
Mhm.
But they're also different, and I think those differences are what makes it interesting, certainly to write, and I think also to read.
Mhm. You had mentioned that there's a pretty big age gap between you and your husband. Did that at all influence the age gap between Mary and Sherlock?
Oh, no doubt. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, people, we were having this discussion on something the other day about how uncomfortable it is to think of a story. I mean, it wasn't in the 90s, but now it's uncomfortable to think of a story that starts with a girl of 15 and ends up with her marriage to her teacher.
Mhm.
I mean, there's all kinds of issues that have, that have light shown on them now in a way that they didn't in the 90s. It was, I mean, it would have been unacceptable even then to have her marry someone who was her teacher. And if those of you who have only read The Beekeeper's Apprentice, awfully sorry, there's a spoiler here. But they do eventually get together as in a partnership,
Mhm.
for any number of reasons. But I think that that age difference in Russell and Holmes, like the age difference between my husband and me, is less because of, I mean, the age difference is less important than the sort of sociological differences. I mean, my husband was born and raised in India, and the things that got in the way of us speaking each other's language, as it were, was not the fact that he was born in 1922. It was the fact that he was born in a country that, he didn't have a telephone, he didn't have a car, he didn't have, I mean, he grew up with servants. And I mean, all the things that made his life when he was young extremely different from mine were things that would occasionally pop up and be a bit jarring.
Mm.
Um, the fact that he was 30 years older was really relatively unimportant in the, in the realm of oddities in a marriage.
So Jane asks, did you always plan to have Mary and Sherlock become a married couple? Since we're doing spoilers anyways, might as well start there.
Um, you're asking me to remember where my head was in the late 1980s. And all I can say is that it only makes sense as the beginning, the book only makes sense as the beginning of a series. And as a series, you have to, you have to look at your two characters and say, okay, I've got a young woman, I've got a man. And to have a series that's set in the 20s and those two have no legal excuse to be together would have meant continuously having to work around it. I mean, just from a practical point of view, to have a partnership that was just a partnership meant that every time they went somewhere, they would encounter the question of, is there a chaperone here?
Mhm.
Every time they had to stay someplace, they'd have to work around the fact that they weren't married.
Mhm.
Um, and it was just so much simpler. Just, just marry her now, for God's sakes, just get. um,
Well,
so just from a practical point of view,
it's interesting to me because I love the books because of the romantic element of it. Not necessarily that there was romance in it, but that Sherlock always seemed in all of the canon so lonely, alone, with his smartness and his way of thinking. But all of the more recent um, sort of takes on it have him having some sort of love interest,
Mhm.
or at least getting to that point of not being so alone. So I think it's interesting that you were really on the early end of that sort of movement.
Yeah, yeah. I, I mean, Conan Doyle was doing something very different with his stories from what I'm doing with these, and I think he he wasn't so interested in growing the character as he was telling an exciting tale.
Hmm.
I used Holmes as a supporting actor for the first half a dozen books, and then became more interested in him as a character and began to really grow him, until the fact that, I mean, the book that has just come out, which I'll wave in front of the screen, um, has just, Lantern's Dance has just come out, is all about Holmes and his background.
Hmm.
None of which is in the Conan Doyle stories. I mean, is this much in the Conan Doyle stories. But I found him more and more interesting as a character to write and to look at what would this amazing person have done if he'd actually met someone who was his equal from, early on.
Hmm.
Watson is a great guy. He's a absolutely strong character and, super when he needs assistance. He's not a challenge to Holmes.
Hmm.
And I think that somebody like that needs a challenge in his life and in his relationships.
Hmm.
So, starting with about book number 7 or so, I think I started working on him as a developing character and looking at what would this man look like if he were to work in the post-war era, because Conan Doyle cut him off at the beginning of the Great War, so he never had to deal with this extremely different Britain of the 20s. Um, what would he look like if he had somebody who really challenged how he did things?
Hmm.
Um, and what would he look like if he let someone in underneath his defenses?
Hmm.
And that's kind of where his side of the story has been going, and the current one is all about that.
I'm seeing in the chat people are really enjoying it. Um, was it surprising to you how protective Sherlock is of Mary?
Not really. I think that he's a Victorian gentleman to his bones, and in the Conan Doyle stories, um, there's a lot of that attitude of, um, you know, women shouldn't be put into any danger.
Hmm.
So that's something that, no matter how competent his partner is, he's not going to shake that.
Okay.
And it would take, a deliberate rethinking on his part to permit her to do her own thing. I mean, he does,
Mhm.
but each time he does, it's clearly something that he has to choose deliberately to do.
Mhm. Right. Linda asked this really interesting question. What were your feelings or thoughts about using Sherlock Holmes when the character only came into the public domain in 2022?
Long story there. Anyone who is interested in this, in the saga of Sherlock Holmes in the public domain, there's a website called Free Sherlock that a friend and I keep up, which follows the court case about the public domain and up to the Court of Appeals and up to the Supreme Court. And public, Sherlock Holmes is indeed in the public domain. And in fact, this year, all of the stories are now in the public domain.
Yes.
Um, I, I mean, when I first wrote Beekeeper, um, many of the stories were still under copyright, but the estate, the Conan Doyle estate, was not really bothering. I mean, there were still I think there was, I think there was still, Jean was still involved with it. I can't remember when she died or turned it over to others, but it wasn't until later that it became basically a business proposition.
Mhm.
Um, if you want to use these characters, you have to pay us. And that's what the court cases were about. So
Mhm.
I yeah, I laid it all out in front of the publisher early on, and said, I don't know if I can do this or not. You're gonna have to have their in-house lawyers look at it, and they obviously did, and they obviously said, oh, it's fine. So
Well, we're very glad. But also, there's been a lot of adaptations in the last few years.
yeah,
Enola Holmes, Sherlock, Elementary, all of them that came in before 2022. So I'll have to read that. I put the blog in the chat.
yep.
Fran asks, will you and Leslie do more collections in the style of Sherlock Holmes short stories?
We are looking for a publisher to do another one. I think we have 5. Um, the one who did the last 4 of them has decided to do something else, and so he's not interested. So we're talking to other people. It would be nice to do them. I mean, nobody makes money off of short stories, but they're an enormous amount of fun to do.
Hmm.
If you don't know what we're talking about, Les Klinger and I have done a series of, we've edited a series of collections of stories inspired by the Sherlock Holmes canon with, everybody from, from Sarah Paretsky to Lee Child, um, who, will write something that is in some way related to the home stories, and they're all just fabulous. They're just such fun.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much to dive into. There's so much you can pull from. Um, Suzanne asked, what led you to wanting to celebrate The Beekeeper's Apprentice? Do you have a special fondness for this book, or are you just amazed that it got to 30 years?
Well, yeah, I mean, 30 years and never out of print is an extraordinary thing.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that the thing that I really wanted to do was to acknowledge and to express my gratitude for the community that has come up around it. It's not something that that as a writer you can deliberately plan of having people who love your characters so much that they talk about it. Um, and I mean, I've had people write me and say that they were inspired by Mary Russell and decided to go to Oxford and study theology. And you think, really? There's no money in that, right? Um, People who've traveled the footsteps of Mary Russell, real friendships that have come around the books.
Mhm.
There's a very very busy Facebook group called The Beekeeper's Apprentices, that anyone who is not a member out there who is interested in Russell, all you have to do is apply, and
Mhm.
I think there's a question that you have to ask to prove you're not a robot.
Yeah, it's
Um,
important nowadays.
yeah, but they're such fun people. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do these 4 events that are, as I said, in Santa Cruz and the 3 other cities, each of which is the day before one of the mystery conferences. So they're kind of attached in there. So people can start, can meet up and can put a face to, the woman who does the Mary Russell Twitter feed, for example.
So
And the woman who organizes the Facebook group, and people like that who are important in the community, and you get to meet them.
I love that, because it is a community, and Vanessa actually says this perfectly. Fangirl comment. After reading The Beekeeper's Apprentice, it practically ruined Sherlock Holmes for me. I always miss Mary Russell when I read Sherlock Holmes. You reinvented canon and made it better. Phenomenal.
Thank you.
Um, and then let's see, somebody asked, is there a chance Mary might take up again her studies at Oxford and or reconnect with Judaism and her theological interests?
Well, I think I mean this is one of the problems of Russell and Holmes having such a busy life, is that she doesn't have a whole lot of leisure to sit back or their books. um, I mean, the fact that Holmes is 54, I guess, when you first meet him, means that I wasn't about to take 30 years to tell the stories.
Mhm.
I wanted to just move briskly along, so that I think there's 8 of the books that are set in 1924 alone,
Mhm.
and similar with 1925, that they're fairly back to back, the cases. Um, so that yeah, I mean, she's a continuous presence in Oxford when she's around, but no sooner does she get settled than a ninja spy drops in on her or something.
Those dang ninjas. Which actually brings us to the next question from Steve. Because you had said that your first sentence included Sussex. You weren't sure that where that came from. He says, have you
Mhm.
been to the places that you write about?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I in any of the books that I do, I need to have been there. Um, I think the only place that I've written about that I haven't been to is Vietnam. I wrote a section about the Vietnam War in one of the contemporary books. And there was some state that I also wrote about. I can't remember which one it was that I hadn't actually been to, but it it didn't matter because they were just kind of passing through. But yeah, I need to spend time in the place and get a sense of, and sometimes I do it deliberately. I know that I need it, so that like I wrote into one of the books that they had been in Japan, and I did it deliberately because I wanted to make myself go to Japan, because
Mhm.
that kind of trip is a lot of work. So, but I went, I sometimes do that in order to force myself to go. Other times I have no intention of writing a book set in wherever, and just fall in love with it. And that happened, for example, in Garment of Shadows. I the book before that was set partly in Lisbon and then ended in a town right across a little river from Casablanca in Morocco.
Mhm.
So I was in Lisbon, and we flew down and had a week, and we thought, oh, well, let's go. And I said, well, let's go. I just need one day in Casablanca so I can do that research, and then we can go anywhere. So we went to Fez, and I was thinking, oh, this is a nice vacation. And I got to Fez, and I think, oh, I have to write a book here. It's just such a fabulous place.
That's right. And it
So
seems like a place that the Sherlock Holmes would go to.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And similarly with Castle Shade, the one set in Transylvania,
Mhm.
that's that one I had no idea that I was going to write a book there until I came across Bran Castle and thought, It's mine.
I love it. Somebody asked, as a theologian yourself, I was wondering how much of yourself you see in Mary Russell and vice versa.
Well, I mean, that question is always difficult because, there's obvious similarities. Um, I gave her, I gave her an interest in theology because I was interested in theology, and it seemed like anyone sensible would be, right? And it also was a way of contrasting with Holmes, for whom, God talk would be a foreign language.
Mhm.
Um, and the age of our husbands and the fact that she wears her hair on top of her head when she has long hair. But I mean, they're fairly superficial. She's much more competent than I am. And no,
Wow.
I can't throw a knife.
But if you practice, you could.
I
And
doubt it.
a lot of the questions are about research, so you're gonna have to practice just as a research tool. Um, this is the tough one, I think, for all authors is, do you have a favorite of Mary Russell book?
You know, I always love the one that I'm just about to write. I'm very fond of Beekeeper, and there's things that I like about a lot of the others. I'm very fond of the San Francisco Unlocked Rooms. I had a lot of fun with Dreaming Spies, the one set partly in Japan.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I think that, I mean, and I I had a huge amount of fun with Pirate King, even though a lot of people were completely baffled as to what is she doing? Because it's all about Gilbert and Sullivan. And
Mhm.
if you're not a Gilbert and Sullivan person, it makes no no sense. But I mean, what I wanted to do with that book was kind of reset the series and get it back to its more whimsical roots, because they'd been getting sort of dark. I mean,
Mhm.
not dark books, but more serious novels. And
Mhm.
The Language of Bees and God of the Hive were serious crime novels. And I thought that's not what I wanted to do with Russell. So I talked my publisher into letting me do a farce, and I don't think they understood what I was doing either. But some
I
people loved it, and some people said, "Never do this again. This is awful."
I think it's a testament to your readers that will pretty much read anything you write.
Well,
Um,
yeah.
so Jeff is making a comment, which I think is awesome. 30 years ago, I went into my library looking for a book on bookkeeping. The beekeeper's apprentice was accidentally put in the section. I did not realize that it was a Sherlock Holmes book until I got home.
There you
So
go.
he's a fan.
Yeah.
Um, this is an interesting question too, I think. Jennifer asks, what age do you think Holmes should actually retire? You've been questioning the cases together because of his age, maybe, but do you think he can't continue investigating into his 70s? I mean, he seems pretty fit and active and capable. And of course, his mind is a trap.
No, I mean, he's already in his late 60s. I, uh, I don't, I don't expect to ever get him into his 80s, because I'm already 71 myself, and I can't write 3 books a year. So, so I don't think that's a worry I'm gonna have. He's fine. He's got rheumatism, but he has had that since he was 50. So,
So, what would be a sign that the series is coming to an end from your perspective?
I think that, you know, at a certain point, you kind of start to feel that you've done all you can with the characters. I am not feeling that yet with these. Whether I will or not, I don't know. I'm not one of those people um who plans out either a book or a series. I don't. I am not an outliner, and I don't plan a series arc. So, I'm it's not that I have a series of 20 books in mind or something. Um, but I think that, I mean, I have a lot of different books that I would like to write. And I've been very, very fortunate in my publisher that they they have never told me, no, you can't write that. And so what I do is look at what really interests me. And if it's I mean, obviously they would prefer that I write nothing but Russell and Holmes, because they are, they are big, the bigger sellers. And it means that they don't have to do a lot of work to promote them, which is good for them. But if I had a book that I really wanted to write instead, I have no doubt that I could say to them, no, this is what I really want to write. And they would say, okay. I mean, they wouldn't give me as much money in the advance, and they'd insist on two books on the contract, and the next one would be a Russell. But, they're considering what a huge corporation Random House is, and how small a cog I am. They've been very, very good to me.
I think you've been really good to them.
Um,
You
I've
know,
given
all
them
of
a
the
lot of
books.
books.
Yeah. Um, so, um, did you is the genealogy of Holmes drawn from the Arthur Conan Doyle books? Your research there, or your research is so amazing, and your writing is so wonderful. Um, we just love your writing. Can you talk about a little bit about Holmes's genealogy?
Well, yeah. In fact, this was a thing that my publishers and I debated about, whether or not we should add a family tree to the end of the book. And I said, we can't do that because, if somebody flips to the back, would give everything away. So we were going to do one for the book club kit, which, if anyone out there is reading this for a book club, there's a great book club kit. It's really beautiful.
Mhm.
But then I decided, no, well, no, we'll just leave it. The only thing that Conan Doyle says about Holmes's background is, and it's mostly in the story, The Greek Interpreter, that he's from a family of country squires, which means landed gentry. Um, his grandmother was the sister of the artist Vernet, without really saying which artist Vernet it is. But it kind of places that connection in there somewhere.
Mhm.
And that he has a brother who's older than he. Well, the Vernet family was a series of multi-generational artists, several generations of famous painters. And I think it's fairly apparent that Conan Doyle means Horace Vernet as the sister, because that's the right generation in there. So I needed to work that into this story, into Lantern's Dance, in a way that that told us something about Holmes, and that sort of also revealed how that family connected up with the Holmeses of England.
Mhm.
And without giving spoilers, because I'm sure some of your people have not read or have not finished Lantern's Dance, so we're not doing spoilers here. But I wanted to look at that genealogy, and the Vernet family is incredibly complicated, and there's a couple of places where Russell talks about that in the story. That is much simplified, what you see in there, because what I had originally put in there is, one of those sections in a book where you've got 3 pages of complexity, and your editor says, what? So you have to go through and you weed it all out so that it's just point, 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 instead of tangle, tangle, tangle. So, but yeah, they were a madly complicated family. And the names, I mean, they all used the same names. They had like 4 names that they kept trading around, the daughters and the sons, and there was a Louis and a Louise in the same family and the same generation. You think, why would you do that? Anyway,
It makes it a little
like George,
difficult.
like George Foreman and all his kids named George.
George. Or all the families where like all the girls are Mary, but they go by their middle name.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So Nancy asks if you actually do your own research or do you work with researchers?
It sort of depends. I do my own research. I am always on the lookout for an expert when it comes to certain kinds of things. So that when
Mhm.
I was writing a book that had sections in it of a car, a 1920s car, I found a guy who was up at the car museum in Danville, Blackhawk Car Museum, who told me all kinds of things. And in a later book, he told me how I could fix it so that this particular car would stop running at a certain point. And I mean, things like that. Airplane, I found a guy with an airplane who could fix all kinds of things for me in the book. And those, to find somebody who has both a passion for something and the knowledge to set things out there is really helpful.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, a lot of it is just a matter of digging in and doing the research. As I said, I used to do it all in libraries. I used to have a lot of heavy use of interlibrary loan. Um, Now you can get so many things both as downloads and as cheap ebooks. I mean, cheap used books from one of the online sellers that it's really fabulous.
Mhm. Um, Donna asks about this particular thing that you're doing this year. Are you enjoying going to all these places? Do you feel like it's something that authors like to do, or is it, you know, kind of difficult to do all this, the book touring?
Well, I'm kind of doing this instead of the book tour. Now, when you say book tour, what we do now is not what I think of as a book tour. I mean, there are a few authors who go on these mega book tours, but when in the 90s and aughts, a book tour for me would be a couple of weeks on the road, and I'd be at a different bookstore every night, and I'd be met at a store, met at the airport by a woman holding my book up and saying, "I'm your author escort," and we do, a newspaper thing and a radio thing and all the rest of it. They don't do those anymore now,
No.
for various reasons, mostly financial. So when I do a book tour, it's mostly just flying somewhere, doing an event, and flying home. You got to sell a lot of books at that event to justify that expense. And so mostly publishers do that as a way of building community, of supporting indie booksellers, of getting the author's name out, because people who go to events, if they're supportive, they will post about the book and the event and the author. And so it's worth it, but it's not the same kind of thing as a book tour used to be.
Mhm.
So these events that I'm doing is something that I am doing, and it's like the library events, these four Russell and Holmes 30th anniversary beekeeper celebrations. Um, I am doing what I want. I have, we're doing a couple of the events have a guy teaches us how to pick locks, because that's, in any mystery book, and especially in these ones, these characters are forever picking locks. I don't know how to pick a lock. So, but the guy who comes, you can show us how to pick a lock. And so you have 60 people with their heads down at their locks going, "I did it." It's so fun. The one in Bethesda, I have a woman who is an expert in clothing, who's going to be talking about what Russell would wear.
Hmm.
And oh, and we also have a knife thrower coming to that one. So it's it's going to be each of the events will be different, and they'll all be a different community, and they'll all be and I really enjoyed the first one that we did on the 17th, and I'm imagining that I will enjoy the others as well.
Now remind me, all of your events are on your website.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
I,
there's a little button there that has events, and there's both all of the events that I'm doing, and there's a separate section of the four 30th anniversary events. So
I love that somebody went to your lock picking session in Santa Cruz.
no, no, there's these
Robin.
locks that are see-through, so you can watch it, and you're working there with the pick and the thing, and you go,
Now, are they,
Seattle, we're doing them in Seattle.
Oh, okay. Anybody who's in Seattle can look it
Yeah.
up.
Yeah,
Um,
we can't do it in Nashville because Tennessee law prohibits lock pickings as a sport.
but the
Sorry.
knife throwing is in Bethesda.
Yeah, my throwing is in Bethesda
Okay.
and possibly in Nashville, but we haven't finished organizing it yet, but
They do seem like they're a little strict down there. Um, Ron has the same question I do. Has there ever been TV or movie interest in the Russell series? Russell
yeah,
House.
on and off, there have been 2 or 3 different companies who were interested in it. Yeah, we had one sort of long-term relationship with with a production company in Britain over the COVID time. And it just, COVID was just so disruptive. It didn't just slow stuff down, it changed everything. And so when we came out of it, all of the projects that they had had going suddenly came back and dumped themselves. And so it fell apart, which is
Mm.
really sad because they were a good group, and I think it would have been an interesting project. But we will find another group that loves Russell.
Well, we all love Russell, but who do you want to play Mary and Sherlock?
Well, this question is a regular
Yep.
discussion point on the on groups like the Beekeepers Apprentices. Um, the problem is with Russell, it has to be an actress who is young enough to appear in her teens. I mean, even if she's not 15, you still have to be able to pass for a college student or
Mhm.
university student. Um, and I mean, there's a fair number of actresses, young female actors out there who I think would be good. But I don't know them that well, so I couldn't say. Um,
I'm gonna crowdsource this question and ask people in the audience if they have somebody in mind to
who
play.
would you recommend? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. And
And
I mean, I think there's been various actors that would be great fun as Holmes, but gradually they've gotten kind of older and older, and this sort of thing, you know. Um, eh, I think that most of the guys that I have thought of over the years have gradually sort of aged out. So
well, and Holmes is getting older as well, so it's okay.
yeah,
Marcy says this funny thing, and it's more of a comment. She said, "I got so nervous at the back room, I did not ask my question." Her question is, "Why did you decide to enter the Holmes canon?" But we answered that earlier on in our talk, so I'm gonna ask Marcy to watch the video after after we do this. Jennifer asks, we were talking about you traveling around and stuff. Did you ever go to Australia because your writing about Sydney and Melbourne was so accurate?
yeah, yeah. I've been to Australia a couple of times. So yeah.
Okay. Emily Blunt. She can look like anybody. Okay. Um, let's see. So I read someplace that you don't think that Mary and Holmes will have children together. And there's reason for Mary for sure.
I think that that's introducing such a different take on the thing. I mean, I think that um, Elizabeth Peters did a great job of introducing a new generation to the Amelia Peabody stories, and
Mhm.
she did a great job with that. But I can't see them fitting into the Russell Holmes milieu at all. I mean, I even have problems working Watson in. And and I just can't see having a kid underfoot. Uh, you know,
Yeah. Well, no spoilers. I won't go there. Linda asks, "Are you a skilled chess player, sacrificing the queen to save the game?"
yeah, no. My 13-year-old grandson beats me every time.
Oh, that's so funny. Um, Somebody asked, "How did Holmes's view of Russell's gender fluctuate, and did it depend on their marriage?"
His view of her gender?
Yeah, the fact that she was a woman in, embodying like his brain kind of thing.
Well, I think that once he realizes that she's not a young boy, um, I think you know what, he has to, obviously, as I was saying, you've got these Victorian attitudes towards, you know, the little woman and how she's to be protected.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that's always been a bit of a battle for Russell to make sure that she stood up and pushed that attitude away. But I I think I mean, it has been from the early days of the stories that, you know, part of asserting herself is asserting the fact that, you know, she's she's not a man with breasts, she's a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I, you know, this is one of those things of the constant negotiations in a marriage is to find this sort of common ground that that two people can, you know, can agree even sometimes if they disagree. So
Mm-hmm. I guess that's the mystery to some, especially for me, because Sherlock Holmes has always seemed so distant from people. And for him to have this relationship with Mary just seems so antithetical to how he's always been portrayed. So you bringing it together and making it so realistic has really like opened my eyes to the possibilities of him.
well, I think that Russell herself is a bit aloof when it comes to people. I mean, she doesn't make friends easily.
Mhm.
And it's one of those situations where the two of them are both extremely independent and mistrusting of people in general.
Mhm.
But once they come across each other, you know, life begins to make sense.
Mhm. And that maybe they're not alone in the universe
Yeah.
with the way they think. I have two more questions before we run out of time. What are you reading?
I'm actually reading a sort of a whole bunch of women sci-fi fantasy writers. I've sort of jumped into the Hugo and Nexus Awards, and I'm reading my way through them, and I'm finding them. I mean, they're really interesting ways of telling stories.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Do you not read mysteries as much, especially if you're writing? I guess I have a couple more questions.
yeah, when I'm especially when if I'm working on a book, I tend not to read mysteries because it, you know, my head spends all day there and
Mhm.
it doesn't want to do it anymore.
Hmm. And last question. Now that I know Lantern's Dance just came out, but Jane wants to know if there's another book in the pipeline.
Yeah, I'm working on one now. It's it's going to be for those of you who have read the short story collection. There's a short story collection called Mary Russell's War. The
Hmm.
first one in there is Mary's Christmas, and in it we are introduced to Mary's ne'er-do-well uncle, the black sheep of the family, Uncle Jake, who gives her the knife that she you know, her throwing knife. And in 1925, she's going to encounter Uncle Jake again. So the next one will be Uncle Jake and what the rascal has been getting up to in the intervening years.
And when can we expect this?
I think I think it's penciled in for June next year, 2025.
Okay. And is that going to be the 20th Russell and Sherlock Holmes book?
I think it's 19.
Okay.
Unless you count, I mean, if you count the short story collection, then yes, it's number 20. But
How do,
it's
do you count how do you count them?
it's the 20th, it's the 19th book length and the 20th volume, so it sort of depends what you call it.
Totally works. Okay, well, we'll be celebrating with you next year and for all
But
of your books. Lori, thank you so much for doing this. I know that you're spending the year celebrating, but I really, really appreciate it that you celebrated with us tonight.
I thank you for inviting me, and I wish all of you the best, whether you're whether you're near the library or very far from the library. And, vote for your library in the next election.
That's right. And, if you see her, Lori on Facebook, she's legit. Just wanted to end with
Well,
that.
I don't know about that.
You've totally been great. Thank you
Right.
so much. And thank you for everybody who joined us tonight. Obviously, we had a great
I'm
time.
fascinated by these little things that are showing up on the Zoom thing. There's these little hearts and thumbs and things. I don't know where they're coming from, but they're
There's a
startling me.
there's a reaction button down at the bottom, and
Oh, yeah.
obviously our attendees have discovered it, so
Okay.
they're loving it. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you all.